Hello, Security Dilemma listeners. This is AJ. Just a quick producer's note of housekeeping before we get going with this episode. We recorded this podcast on April 29th, which marked the 100-day mark of the Trump administration. In the episode, we discussed rumors that then National Security Advisor Michael Waltz was on the way out and speculated about who might replace him with Curt Mills. Just 2 days later, but before we uploaded the podcast, President Trump announced that Waltz was being reassigned to the position of ambassador to the United Nations, while Marco Rubio would undertake the Kissingerian role of both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor on an interim basis. There are new rumors that are percolating as to who will be the long term fit for that role, or how long Rubio will be in that role. But the White House has yet to select a permanent appointee for this non Senate confirmed role. Still, especially with regard to that aforementioned point, this segment about Waltz and potential successors is well worth your time, as is the rest of the podcast. We just wanted to take the opportunity to clarify that all for you. That's all from me. Now let's get right back to the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Security Dilemma, a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. My name is A.J. Manuzzi, and I'm joined by my colleague, John Allen Gay, as we have a conversation with Curt Mills. Curt is the executive director of the American Conservative, where he previously served as the senior reporter as well as a contributing editor. He specializes in foreign policy and campaign coverage, as you'll note from our conversation. In our discussion today, we talked about the first 100 days of the Trump administration and its foreign policy. We talked about the Trump administration's ambitions for diplomacy with Iran and Ukraine, its fixation on the annexation of Greenland, as well as potential 2028 presidential contenders on both sides and where the respective parties might go on foreign policy by then. Let's jump right into our conversation with Curt Mills.
Curt Mills, welcome to Security Dilemma. I'm curious for your thoughts on the first 100 days of Trump foreign policy. What's animating that foreign policy? We are taping this on day 100. There are 1,300 more days and some change remaining. How is it looking so far, and what's driving it?
So I think thus far it has been just a spring out of the gate. I'm not sure there has been a first 100 days of an administration like this. I mean, maybe Reagan, certainly FDR, but there's sort of, intense energy. The government feels that it has an enormous mandate to do a lot. It's shaking up a lot of norms, and foreign policy is no exception. I think what strikes me, though, is that the two main things that were on the table that Trump frankly inherited, a war in the Middle East that could either end or expand, and the grinding stalemate in Russia and Ukraine. Those are still the main topics 100 days later. Now, we're well past the, solve the issue in a day, which, the president now says he was joking about, et cetera, et cetera. But, if that becomes the state of play, say not so much on day 200, but day 500 or day 300 or 1 year in, I think you start to see a recognition that these become Trump's wars. So I think that's the real liability for the White House. I think what has been interesting, not so much in the first 100 days, but in the last 25 days, is that it seems as if momentum has surprisingly moved towards a deal on the Middle East, at least as far as the Iran section of it goes, way faster than a lot of people expected. I mean, it wasn't even a fait accompli 45 days ago that there would be even negotiations at all. And that the Russia-Ukraine talks, which looked as if they were, speed running to a potential resolution. I remember there was some discussion of whether or not Trump would attend the victory in Europe, Great Patriotic War parade next week in Moscow. Those seem to have somewhat run aground, and there's actually considerable cause for concern. In diplomacy, everything's fluid, as you and the listeners of this pod doubtless know. But I think there have been ample surprises in the first 100 days.
I've got a similar follow-up to that. What worries you the most about the Trump foreign policy moving forward, and what gives you the most optimism? What's the sort of rose and thorn case for the Trump foreign policy?
Yeah, my answer is the same: Iran and Iran. Uh, so, I mean, I think the kind of skirting right up against nuclear war that occurred in parts of the Biden administration, where, of course, you might remember that, President Biden basically declared regime change before walking it back. That's not the kind of thing that I suspect will happen under Trump. We can get into it if you want. But the range of options on Iran, from the U.S. co-sponsoring strikes with the Israelis by the summer, to the U.S. signing a broader and deeper deal with the Iranians than the JCPOA ever was, both seems very possible and very imminent.
How plausible do you think that kind of US war with Iran is? Because one of the things that really strikes me is like the threat has been pretty direct, pretty explicit. There's been talk of like a specific 60-day clock, which we're maybe a third to half of the way through right now. Although the administration doesn't seem to emphasize that a lot, but it just doesn't feel to me like the president and his administration are preparing the country for potentially a very significant war. They're not doing, what cynics call manufacturing consent for a conflict. In fact, they're signaling a great deal of optimism about the prospects of diplomacy. You don't see people within the administration, within the core of the administration, going around hyping the Iran threat and trying to get Americans to support a conflict. What do you think's going on here?
I think it's different than obviously the example that everybody reaches for, Iraq, where what you described occurred in the '02 period, right? The U.S. Administration was obviously priming the pump, getting the Americans ready for a potential full-on assault, which is what occurred. But what I do think is occurring here is that they're clearly talking about the kind of airstrikes that went on in the later part of the '90s on Iraq, and I think that led fairly inevitably towards a U.S. showdown with Saddam. And then secondarily, what you see is a far, 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 far more bellicose Israeli state led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who wants a confrontation. And I think his network within the United States itself is as aggressive, if not more so, than in the after 9/11 period. So I think it's obviously not a one-to-one comparison. You can't one-to-one comparison Iran and Iraq, but I think there's enough cause for concern. And then additionally, no one knows how. The type of strike that was floated in the New York Times piece a few weeks ago, that I'm sure most of your listeners read. Talking about strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, Israeli commando units, and U.S. air support for said commando units, and then future U.S. Support for any Iranian reprisal. No one knows how that's going to go. And then additionally, once the U.S. crosses the Rubicon of actually having bombed Iran, no one knows how the Iranian state will react. I think when people thought there was a lot less likelihood of a deal, say in December of January of this year, and certainly when they signed the maximum pressure ordinance again on February 3rd, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not the Iranians will actually just lunge towards the bomb. And I think the estimate is very wildly, but if they put all their state resources into it, then I think the discussion of a war in the aftermath of a bombing campaign where the Iranians are going for a nuke is far more real.
Followers of your work and followers of your commentary on Twitter or X, the Everything app, will note that you've talked a lot about this pressure campaign from hawks in the media, hawks in sort of mainstream hawkish Republican foreign policy to drive President Trump to strike Iran. There's been a lot of reporting on this, and one of the more interesting storylines of late has been neoconservatives attacking Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard for her amplification of intelligence reports from the IC that overwhelmingly suggest that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about what's going on with this Gabbard story and where you may see it going moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that it's notable, but I'm not sure entirely how large of a story it is. I mean, I don't think Gabbard, to my understanding, is, she's been in the job for yeah, less than 100 days. It's not like Gabbard is directing all of these intelligence agencies. I believe up to 18 intelligence agencies came to this conclusion that the Iranians don't have it. And it's not like she's sort of demanding that. I think they came to that conclusion independently, and she's just submitted it. What's going on is an open campaign by the Iran hawk lobby to either ignore or besmirch the intelligence because Gabbard has this sort of realist restrainer type background. It is you mentioned X. And I think X and the current media environment really can't be underrated. It's probably why to the extent that I'm whatever minor bit player in this whole drama, it is contra from 2002 when Vice President Cheney could just march down to Langley and kind of twist some arms and try to get some of the intelligence he wants. You're seeing non-governmental sources often attack governmental sources and try to browbeat them into different conclusions on the intelligence, and it's pretty dangerous, and it's pretty shameless, and it's pretty open.
Yeah, the national intelligence estimate on Iran has been a source of controversy for neocons ever since 2007,
Right.
when they started saying in these assessments, like, yeah, they're not currently pursuing nuclear weaponization. And I actually thought that this year's NIE was slightly stronger, appropriately so, in that it said, hey, the Iranians are starting to talk about weaponization in
Right.
new ways. At least that's my recollection of the wording, because that was a real development that happened in the months before. I think it was the annual threat assessment that we're talking about here. And so, like, there is, I think, a real crisis starting to develop with Iran, where we've had this long period where we've been able to have no Iranian bomb and no war and not very much diplomacy with them. And that paradigm seems to be slowly breaking down. And I think, Trump's talk of a timeline has sort of accelerated it. I wanted to zoom in here, though, on one of the players in this and the Ukraine conflict and the Israel-Gaza conflict, which is Steve Witkoff. What do you make of his role in all this? Because he was not a major figure in the first Trump administration.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, he's sort of a deus ex machina, right? I mean, nearly quite literally, he's beaming around the world in his Gulf Stream and just changing diplomacy and national security discussions and conversations in real time. I mean, look, I think to an extent, it's a continuation with one element of Trump's first administration, which is Trump tries to get the personnel he wants into, let's say, the big three offices of state of national security, Secretary of State, Defense, and NSC. And when either the works of government are gummed up or he loses faith in the principles that run those organizations, he runs to people that are sort of outside of, let's say, official channels. The evidence suggests that people like Carlson were extremely important in the first term. Bannon retained extreme importance. And I think, with Witkoff and this sort of probably the most powerful special envoy in American history to this point that I can think of, at least in recent American history, having power that's arguably either parallel or superior to the actual Secretary of State is pretty astonishing. And Witkoff's instincts, this is a 60-something New York Jewish real estate wheeler dealer. His instincts appear to be fairly moderate on foreign policy, much like Trump's utterances, I would say, on the campaign trail in 2016 on a number of foreign affairs issues. Why can't we work with the Russians? Why can't we work with the Iranians? Kind of things that, weren't said by GOP establishmentarian types, including Rubio, who's now the Secretary of State. It's just a huge changeup. And for all the advantages that people like Rubio, Hegseth, and Waltz, these sort of 40-something, 50-something Republican politicians, I guess Hegseth is a sort of a newer player on the block. For all the advantages that they have, they don't have the same background as Witkoff does with Trump. And I think Trump is naturally closer to the kind of thing that Witkoff says. This is the sort of undistilled, almost third party Donald Trump of 15 years ago. This is really what it is. It's not Marco Rubioism. It's not Michael Waltzism. And, for as much as Trump likes Fox News, he's not a Bush Republican. And that's kind of a lot of what, Hegseth has done for most of his career.
Supporting Witkoff in the latest rounds of the Iran talks has been another important Trump world figure, Michael Anton. He's currently running the policy planning staff at State. He was the technical team lead for these Iran talks. And you're something of a proponent of his, or a convert to Antonism. You wrote earlier this year, if successful, which I suspect will be the case, Anton's tenure will invariably be compared to that of George Kennan. Do you feel like he's living up to those words?
I think so far. I mean, the news, 6, 7 days ago is that he was put in charge of the technical aspects of the Iran negotiations. So, A, the Iran negotiations had moved far enough that we're talking about technical details, and B, anyone who was near the initial JCPOA discussions, will say that the technical stuff is what really makes or breaks these kinds of deals. So the fact that Anton has returned from being an NSC official under McMaster and Flynn to the Trump fold 7 years later. He took the policy planning job, which, it is what you make of it. I think Peter Berkowitz under Pompeo or Kieran Skinner under Pompeo did different things than maybe Anton would do. And then to take on an expanded role at policy planning in a State Department that is sort of a weird scene because you obviously have a pretty VIP Republican guy on top of it, but a lot of empowered deputies, as far as I understand, kind of do their own things. Yeah, I think Anton fits that mantle. And look, Kennan's a big name in foreign policy, but he's almost a bigger name for his service outside of government, his commentary outside of government. And I think that's where Anton tracks. I mean, few Trump officials have the paper trail that he has. I mean, even in the last 7 years, the long articles that Anton was submitting to the Claremont Review of Books on Russia-Ukraine details, the painstaking debates that he would have with other conservative intellectuals on Taiwan and China, et cetera, et cetera. All of this smacks of the sort of manic energy and often, to an extent, divisive energy that Kennan himself had. First-rate intellect, someone who's not afraid of praxis, and someone who can be very effective, but also not everyone's cup of tea. I think that describes the Michael Anton I've encountered.
What about J.D. Vance, the vice president? He's definitely much more visible and active in the administration than, say, Kamala Harris was during the Biden administration.
Sure.
Possibly even than Mike Pence was in the first Trump. He seems to be one of the most powerful vice presidents we've had in a while in terms of informal power, perhaps since Cheney even. How do you think he's doing, especially because people talk about him as a potential 2028 contender? I saw it as a succession pick when Trump named him as his nominee, that he's the figure, he's the great successor who will continue the Trumpian revolution.
Well, it certainly was not a succession pick. He picked he wasn't even 40 when he got picked. He turned 40 in early August after the convention, and you pick somebody who obviously has that level of ambition, that level of gravitas, that level of interest in the ideology. As such, it's not like picking Doug Burgum or something like this. It's obviously laden with a lot more expectation. You mentioned all of the VPs in the 21st century, except for the one I do want to compare him to, which is Biden, which is a powerful vice president, but not so powerful that he arguably overshadows number one, which obviously became a problem even for Cheney and Bush, but powerful enough that it's someone who has portfolio, someone who has gravitas, someone who has major name recognition, and someone who later becomes the president. I think, if for a vice president who wants to be president, Biden is kind of the gold standard in my lifetime. For a vice president who wants to maintain maximum power in the position and is not as per se interested in becoming president himself. Obviously, no one was more powerful yet destructive as Cheney. And then, in terms of the weak vice presidents, I mean, Harris and Quayle, I think, compete for that mantle. And at least until Harris took over as the Democratic nominee. Gore, I think I know less about, but I think the relationship between Trump and Vance at this point is much stronger than the Clinton-Gore relationship, which was famously estranged even by 2000.
So talking about those potential nominees beyond J.D. Vance, who do you see making early plays to be a name for 2028 among Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, I think Cruz is certainly running. Cruz has been telling people he's running, and then Cruz, overtly broke with the administration on tariffs, which is, I mean, if you hear people say it, Trump's really prized issue. Disagree or agree, but it's the one major consistency of his public statements on politics the last 40 years. It's something that he's been very much driving the bus on. Cruz broke with him on it, not loudly, but clearly. And I did a piece on Politico on this. I think in the MAGA lane, you can't rule out that Steve Bannon will give it a go, frankly. And obviously that's complicates Vance's bid to power. You can't entirely rule out that Donald Trump Jr. would run, which obviously majorly complicates Vance's potential route to power. And then, I think Haley is keeping herself in the mix. She was the runner-up last time, and you can get some Republican consultant to charge you $10,000 a month to tell you the number of times that the Republican runner-up became the nominee the next go-around. I mean, it stretches back at least since Reagan in '76, and then H.W. and then McCain and then Romney and on and on and on. Trump is the one who wrote the streak, frankly. And sorry for Rick Santorum, but I think that those are the early names. There's some discussion you've heard of Rubio. I think less so now than maybe 3 months ago. But again, Rubio's run before. Rubio's been in the mix for a while. Doesn't really matter the ups or downs of any particular quarter. If he wants to run, he'll run. Yeah, those are the big names that top of mind for me sitting here in spring 25.
Do you think that if a lot of these figures came up, you would see something of a Republican foreign policy restoration toward the pre-Trumpian consensus? Because a lot of those figures, well, some of them at least, are people who, in Haley's case, impute a kind of George W. Bush foreign policy to her with plenty of grounds. People saw Rubio that way, but he seems to have evolved. Cruz is an interesting guy, but he's certainly more hawkish than Trump. What do you think their play is going to be?
Look, it all depends on the environment, how successful this administration is or is perceived to have been. I mean, Haley, I think at this point is just the open candidate of the Wall Street Journal editorial board. This is an upscale Republican voter, suburban voter who just wants to return to Romneyism. I think that's the kind of money she attracts, the kind of support she attracts, the kind of policy ideas she attracts. And that's the publication I would most compare her perspective with. It's not anti-Trump, but man, it is pretty close. And, from there, Cruz, I mean, I think, I don't remember if his podcast was ever hosted by it, but I mean, he strikes me as he's kind of a Daily Wire Republican. This is the group of people that really opposed Trump most vociferously in 2016, but they're so, marinated in red state America that it's so to be ridiculous to oppose him. But anytime it gets hot, tariffs, they're going to complain. A foreign policy thing, they'll certainly, attack either Trump or his acolytes, or say, only the czar knew, something like this. That's very much where Cruz is coming from. And then, the other ones I named, Trump Jr. is seen as basically simpatico with Vance, even more ideological than his father. So who knows if he ever runs. People think he won't, but can't rule it out. And then, I think Bannon speaks for himself. He's, it's the godfather of nationalist populism. It's more Trump than Trump in some ways.
Yeah.
And Vance has obviously aligned himself as a dyed-in-the-wool Trumpian.
What about the Democratic side? Who do you see setting themselves up for 2028?
I mean, my view is that it's AOC's to lose right now. That was my view after the election. I think unlike both parties are amidst civil wars, but the thing that's different about Democrats is there actually are real live breathing establishment Democrats that don't live in Washington D.C. I'm not as convinced that that's true of establishment Republicans, and so there's a ton of moderate Democrats, but that lane is close. It is going to be Newsom, Buttigieg, Whitmer, Shapiro, on and on. Rahm Emanuel is talking about running. I mean, it is going to be Cory Booker. Andy Bashir. It's just like it's already 8, 9. I'm just rattling them off. There's conceivably 30 people you've even heard of, versus the sort of, it's different. They're different people, obviously, but AOC strikes me as like a pretty direct inheritor of the burning wing. And I think people underestimate the degree to which a lot of Democratic voters, especially younger, let's say millennial or like late Gen X people, kind of went from Obama was their guy to Bernie was their guy. I think in D.C. we think of Obama as very aligned to Clinton, which is the truth. But out in the Democratic primary, I think the same thing here. If Sanders isn't run, almost certainly he's not going to. He's Ayatollah aged, although who knows? Who knows? He seems fairly sharp for his age. And if he doesn't run, I think the chances of the mantle directly being transferred to AOC. I mean, he's certainly not dispelling that notion by appearing in nationwide tours with her that she's heir apparent. I think it's going to be hard to beat. And then additionally, what is the real reason why Democrats are losing national elections? The astonishing movement of Hispanic voters towards Republicans in the last 6 years. I don't know if a Costco protest is going to be able to break that trend. But man, she's a pretty good attempt at it than, picking somebody not Latina.
The other thing that's interesting to me about AOC is that she's one of the first like millennial politicians. And being a millennial myself, and millennials are a huge generation. We're all getting older, meaning we're likely to start voting more, start getting more involved in politics, be more of a voter base. And I think her political style, like that of a lot of millennial politicians, resonates a lot with regular millennials, that she's willing to speak directly to people, willing to speak relatively frankly. She comes off very accessible. So I definitely do share the view that she's a very strong contender if she wants it. Do you think she challenges Schumer?
For the Senate?
Yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm not an expert on Democratic intra-party, but it just seems like that's almost as hard as running for president. And so why not? It's very similar to Trump running for New York governor in 2014. You might lose, and you might not even get the top prize. Why not go big?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So zooming out a bit on this, the other big question with the Democrats is where they're going to go on foreign policy. I look at
Sure.
at some of the polling that's come out in recent years where you'll see a significant chunk, like a quarter to a third, that favors the Israelis and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You'll see another significant chunk of similar size that favors the Palestinians. And
Sure.
then the plurality remainder is pretty much pox on both of their houses. And so if you're a politician to try to craft a position for that, or for any number of other foreign policy issues, because some of the China that Trump is breaking is China that people don't mind seeing broken. Like if he keeps pulling troops out of the Middle East, if he keeps talking about burden sharing in Europe, that's not going to be something where there's a huge base of voters ready to sign up to undo that. There's a lot of people, I think, in the Democratic base who would like to see things like that, just like to see it done differently. So I'm curious what you think is going to happen with Democratic foreign policy, because as you said, there are real establishment Democrats outside Washington who are going to favor the kind of watered down Clintonism that we've
CIA
seen.
Democrats.
CIA Democrats.
Yeah. I think for the foreseeable future, that is until the primary, and then I think if I'm wrong, again, I'm just stabbing in the dark here a little bit, but like if it's not an AOC nominee, I think the chances of like a hyperdrive version of what we saw with Kamala Harris's campaign is extremely possible. I mean, I would point, your listeners to the Alyssa Slotkin response to Trump's congressional address. I mean, that was the kind of bellicosity and perhaps inevitable result of the Democratic wholehearted embrace of the establishment that has occurred at least since Obama. That is the kind of Democratic Party that doesn't understand or doesn't care to understand, why it was imprudent to, campaign with Liz Cheney. The kind of party that might have made Liz Cheney National Security Advisor or Secretary of Defense. That's what Slotkin's speech sounded like to me. And I think it's where a lot of the party wants to go, or at least a lot of the party's leadership wants to go. Trump is, and his gang of jackals in this summation are anti-American. They're destroying American institutions, and we are the safe pair of hands, and we are the true patriots. And that's the nice, clean, quick, and dirty explanation. And if our confidence is assailed on anything, we're more confident on foreign policy than they are. And what's confidence in foreign policy? Well, obviously, embracing our allies and alliances and never questioning them. I think the major confounding variable, and it's been the confounding variable since October 7th, is that the base of the Democratic Party is absolutely disgusted with the Israelis' campaign in Gaza. And if that's ongoing, I think that's a major headwind for establishment control of the party. And someone like Ocasio-Cortez obviously speaks with considerable conviction and persuasiveness about doing something. The establishment Democrats kind of want these protests to go away, more or less. I mean, there's gradations here. Does Cory Booker, who I think is an established Democrat, want the protests to go away? Well, I think it's sort of murky, but does he want a BDS, campaign for president if he's the nominee? Does he want to call for the end of arms sales to Israel? Does he want to call what's occurring there a genocide, as Ocasio-Cortez doubtless would? He does not.
Yeah, I think that's all really interesting. And I think trying to map out these distinct lanes is something that I think a lot of forecasters have the unenviable task of doing the next couple of years. I mean, when I speak with post-mortem, just regular Democrats that I know who are of the younger generation, not even people who are particularly radical, but they're kind of like, Liz Cheney, really? Like, of the people who know who Liz Cheney is, how many people actually like what Liz Cheney represents and know of her because of what her dad did? Do you think that there is a large enough contingent within the Democratic Party for a broader conversation about U.S. foreign policy and changing the narrative beyond the issue of Israel, or is a change going to have to be dependent on a potential change in the U.S.-Israel relationship? Is that kind of the catalyst for everything else?
I mean, I think it's very dependent on who is seen as the standard bearer, and I think when a party is in opposition and doesn't have someone like Donald Trump looming, then the establishment runs the party. So for the foreseeable future, the Democratic establishment runs the party, and the Democratic establishment's approach to foreign policy, I think, looks like very hawkish on Russia, basically where Biden was on China, which is to say more hawkish than Obama was, but maybe not as hawkish as Trump. And on the Middle East is less hawkish than the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party, but probably in some ways more hawkish than some MAGA voices. So it's a bit of a paradox. I think if their party gets a new standard bearer and that standard bearer is successful, it's a different party. It's much like Trump.
Yeah, I've really come to see the 2028 election as potentially quite huge for the trajectory of American foreign policy. Really, not just between candidates, but between parties, because you could run the story in 4 different combos. You get Republicans that are good on foreign policy or bad on foreign policy. Both seem possible. You get Democrats that are good on foreign policy or bad on foreign policy. And so then you could have a scenario in which you have 2 relative reversions to the status quo competing with each other. You could have some mix, which is kind of how I see the 2024 election and the 2016 election. Or you could have 2 improvements on the status quo running against each other, which is the awesome scenario, because then relatively greater restraint wins coming and going, and is
Right.
almost not on the ballot, which would be a real step forward. I don't know if you see things the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think a Vance versus AOC race is much different than a Haley versus Josh Shapiro is probably maybe the most extreme, based on what we know and his statements and such. So, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that people don't. I think people get tired of the horse race. I think people get tired of it, but it's just like, I'm sorry, like this is a much different country if Donald Trump never ran for president. Like you can't tell me that people don't matter.
Yeah, talking about people and personnel and going a little bit back to Trump 1.0, there are some Trump first term insiders that are still vocal about foreign policy issues. For example, you talked about Bannon and Haley a bit, also Mike Pompeo. What's generally going on with some of those folks right now? How are they positioning themselves vis-a-vis the administration, or any of them angling for, as far as the public is concerned, kind of position in the future Trump administration or Vance administration, et cetera?
I mean, I think the idea of Haley or Pompeo working for Vance is pretty unlikely. I mean, Vance is significantly younger than both of those people. I think if Vance takes control of the party and takes control of the executive branch, it will mark an extreme changing of the guard on the Republican side, both on ideology but also just in generations. But I think Haley and Pompeo, I mean, Haley seems like she's gearing up to run. But, you got to remember, by 2028, she'll have been out of government for 10 years. So, I mean, would she say no to, Secretary of State if Rubio left after 18 months or 2 years? I suspect no. Would you say no to Secretary of Defense? Probably not. Pompeo, I think, is making some money. I think Pompeo wants to be president. I think Pompeo would happily add merit badges to his resume. So, I mean, the big one he hasn't done is defense. I don't think it makes any sense to do national security advisor or anything like that. He's already been Secretary of State, and I think that's sort of the approach. And Pompeo is a name that we haven't referenced as potentially running. I just don't think his lane remains unclear. Additionally, another name we haven't mentioned is Tom Cotton, who could potentially take some of these jobs and also be running. And Pompeo and Cotton, I think, basically have nearly identical politics and nearly identical lanes, nearly identical resumes. And Pompeo is from the military academy, and Cotton served, and Pompeo is from represented Kansas, and Cotton represented Arkansas.
Arkansas, as Kansans call it.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. So, I mean, it's just, I mean, they're very similar in a lot of ways. Their personalities are not. Pompeo is far more overtly aggressive, I would say, just interpersonally. Yeah, I think they're all keeping it open, which is why you haven't seen and I think it's been pretty clear, like the sort of like open never Trump lane is a lane that gets John Bolton on CNN, but it's not a lane that gets him rehired. It's not a lane that he can conceivably run for president from. Maybe in the future, I mean, Bolton's looked at running for president, but it's far more. It seems far more savvy and options open to at least officially maintain your Trump support and then see what's happening. Pence is another example of the limits of renouncing Trump.
Sticking with some of these names that we mentioned, and there's been political trouble lately for Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz, leading to people talk about potential successions in both of those roles. Who do you think might be contenders if that were to occur? It certainly seems like they've both been hamstrung, even if Trump is sticking with them for now.
Yeah, I mean, NSC, I think you hear Grinnell. I think you hear Gorka, which I don't think can be totally laughed at. I think you hear, I mean, he's a television character. He's the deputy. Gorka's not a dummy, actually, if you deal with him behind closed doors. Obviously, plays a cartoon on television. I think you hear some discussion of the Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, who's very close with Vice President Vance for SecDef. I think you hear Cotton for SecDef. I think you hear Pompeo for SecDef. I think you hear DeSantis for SecDef, as we heard in December when Hegseth was flaming out. So yeah, it would be sort of a mixed bag. And I think this is like, especially with the Hegseth one, a lot of sort of realists and restrainers We're disappointed to see the fumigation that occurred at the Pentagon 2 weeks ago with people like Colin Carroll and Dan Caldwell sort of randomly and irrationally being fired. But I think a lot of people say, like, well, if you get rid of Hegseth, it could be someone worse. I think that's. I guess my tolerance for risk personally as an analyst and as a person is just higher. I think Hegseth's clearly lost the building and lost control of the job, and it's a question of when he'll leave. But it's very possible that they'll Trump will not want to give scalps, so to speak, to his haters, and we'll at least try to stick with these guys through the summer, if not a year or more. But it's just like, again, it's only been the first 100 days, and I mean, both Walz and Hegseth had major scandals that would have DQ'd them in Trump 1 or almost any other administration.
Oh yeah, I mean Scaramucci got fired for some improper remarks.
Yeah, he called Ryan Lizzo late at night, which I guess is a crime. So
yeah,
that's what it was. He thought it was off the record and just vomited profanities about Reince Priebus and Steve Bannon to Ryan Lizzo at the New Yorker at the time.
So one theme that I've noticed several times in Trump's remarks, both at the inauguration, at his joint session, is the prospect of American territorial expansion,
Sure.
particularly Greenland and or Panama. I'm curious, do you think that that's a serious prospect? I remember I've in a lot of rooms when this kind of thing gets mentioned, rooms full of Republicans, including Republican foreign policy professionals who are favorable to the administration, it tends to get chuckles, not necessarily chuckles of opposition, but kind of oh, there he goes again. And you saw a bit of that. At least I detected it during Trump's joint session speech when he brings up Greenland. Mike Johnson kind of smirks and then starts clapping. So there's a politics to this, but there's also a policy dimension. Do you think this is something serious?
I guess it's the big question. I mean, I think there's a million examples. I mean, Trump running for president itself was a punchline until it was a reality twice. So, or him getting elected, and so I would caveat of that. I think each issue is pretty different. Of the three, so I guess Canada, Panama, and Greenland, I would say Greenland is the most plausible. It's the smallest population. It's in the area, the Arctic, where the U.S. is most openly competing with geopolitical rivals. It seems the easiest to do. The Panama one is, it's something that Rubio and Hegseth have paid a lot of attention to, but it seems like they can basically get what they want, which is like the Chinese out of there in some measure without just annexing the canal or annexing Panamanian territory. We've heard the least about that one of the three. And then Canada, yeah, I mean, I don't really think that Trump is going to send troops to the Canadian border and like go in Sudetenland style. But I guess anything is possible. The Canadians are obviously, with the result last night, are taking it very seriously. I do think, though, it is relevant if Trump becomes a standard bearer on which other nationalist Republicans or other nationalist leaders this century look at, hey, maybe the U.S. should reshore, hey, maybe the U.S. should have dominion in the Americas, further integration with these countries, I think is something that could happen down the line. I think the idea that the U.S. will annex Greenland, Canada, and Panama in the next 4 years seems very unlikely.
Going back to Ukraine really quickly, there's been a lot in the news about the administration's proposed framework for ending the war in Ukraine. And for our listeners who are curious about what that entails, there's been reporting from Axios that it would include the recognition of Crimea as belonging to Russia by the United States, although not necessarily Ukraine. It's a bit unclear. Ukraine not in NATO, a lift of sanctions against Russia, as well as potential Ukrainian EU membership in the future, the administration rejecting limits on Ukraine's the size of its armed forces, as well as they would sign the U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal of yore. What do you make of this proposed framework and the general direction of Trump's Ukraine policy?
I mean, I think it continues to trend towards a deal. I think no other administration, I think the Democratic administration wouldn't have dealt with the reality, which is that the Russians have annexed parts of Ukraine's territory, and absent regime change in Moscow or like the U.S. investing in this war for 10 to 15 more years while risking a nuclear exchange are just not going to get this territory back for the Ukrainian state. And I think, the summer offensive, as you guys know, in 23 was a bust, and Ukraine's been running on fumes ever since. And so I think we see a reasonable framework that can work. I think in general, the minerals deal is sort of a tripwire that's put in by hawks to try to get the U.S. to stay. So, if the U.S. opens up a mine in Ukraine and all of a sudden U.S. soldiers get their heads blown off, then Lindsey Graham can say, well, we need to send X and Y and Z, and the Russians have broke the rules. Putting aside, that part of the world, you get killed. You don't ever fully know who's killing who, especially in sort of these terrorist operations. We don't know the full story on Nord Stream even still. And so, it's pretty dangerous. But with the exception of the minerals gambit, I think the proposals so far look, well within lines of responsible statecraft. The question is, there are skeptics like, Mearsheimer, et cetera, who think that Putin will never sign any of this thing. He's just going to keep this going. The war serves his purposes. He wants more territory. But I think this is a very good stab at getting a deal and ending the war, and I hope it succeeds.
Yeah, my number one rule in geopolitical discussion is if somebody mentions minerals that are not currently being extracted, you're getting scammed.
Yeah, it is the equivalent of the late night gold commercial. It's just maybe someone's making money, but it's probably not you.
Cashforlithium.com. Yeah.
The hour is late and it's a Hail Mary and they're hoping you call it drunk. And, that's the minerals deal.
Curt Mills, thank you for coming on Security Dilemma.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security